Your life looks the way it does right now because of what you repeatedly think, feel, and believe, not because of luck, not because of your past, but because your brain has been trained every single day to run the same programs. The powerful truth is this: your brain can change. And when your brain changes, your life must change too. Your life looks the way it does right now largely because of what you think about most often. This isn't a motivational phrase, and it isn't positive thinking. It's biology. From the moment you wake up, your brain begins to run familiar patterns, scanning for what it already knows. The same thoughts appear, the same inner conversations repeat, and the same emotional reactions follow. Over time, this repetition becomes automatic. The brain is designed to learn through repetition, and whatever you rehearse the most becomes the strongest signal in your nervous system. When a thought is repeated enough times, the brain no longer treats it as a possibility. It treats it as a command. Neurons communicate through electrical and chemical signals, and when the same group of neurons fire together again and again, they wire together into stable networks. These networks become mental habits. This is how a thought turns into a belief. How a belief quietly shapes your behavior without you realizing it. You may think you are making conscious choices, but most of the time your brain is simply executing stored programs. This is why change feels uncomfortable. Brain's primary job is not make you happy, it is to keep you familiar. Familiar feels safe to the nervous system, even if familiar includes stress, self-doubt, or disappointment. If you've spent years thinking in certain ways, your brain has invested energy into maintaining those circuits. The moment you try to think differently, the brain notices the unfamiliar pattern and signals resistance. That resistance often shows up as distraction, doubt, or emotional discomfort, not because you're doing something wrong, but because the brain is protecting what it knows. Most people believe their thoughts come from their circumstances, but neuroscience shows the opposite. Circumstances are often the result of long-standing mental conditioning. When you wake up and immediately think about the same problems, the same frustrations, and the same limitations, you are priming your brain to perceive the world through those filters. Brain then looks for evidence to confirm those thoughts, reinforcing the loop. This is how people unknowingly relive the same emotional day over and over, even when nothing new is happening. What makes this powerful is also what makes it hopeful. The same mechanism that created your current patterns can create new ones. The brain does not care whether a thought is empowering or limiting. It only responds to repetition and emotional intensity. If you repeatedly think thoughts of lack, the brain wires lack. If you repeatedly think thoughts of possibility, the brain begins to wire possibility. This means that change does not start with your environment. It starts with interrupting automatic thinking and choosing what you will rehearse instead. Awareness is the first shift. The moment you notice a habitual thought, you are no longer fully identified with it. You are observing it. That observation creates a small gap between the old program and your conscious choice, and that gap is freedom. Each time you choose not to follow the same mental path, you reduce the energy flowing through that circuit. Over time, unused neural connections weaken. This is not philosophy. This is how the brain conserves energy. Circuits that are no longer reinforced begin to dismantle themselves. At the same time, when you introduce a new thought and repeat it intentionally, especially when paired with elevated emotion, you begin to build a new network. At first, it feels unnatural because it is new. The brain hasn't yet accepted it as familiar. But repetition is a form of instruction. Every time you choose a new way of thinking, you are signaling to the brain that this matters. With enough repetition, the brain starts to treat the new pattern as the default. This process requires patience, not force. Trying to overpower old thoughts often strengthens them. What creates real change is consistency and presence. Conscious repetition is like laying down a new wire. One time doesn't do much. 10 times begins to matter. Hundreds of times reshape the architecture of the brain. Eventually, the new thought no longer feels like effort. It feels like who you are. When that happens, behavior changes naturally. You don't need willpower to act differently because the brain is now signaling a new identity. Actions follow thoughts and thoughts follow wiring. Change doesn't happen because you try harder. It happens because the brain learns something new and begins to express it through your life. And as this new wiring strengthens, the old identity slowly loses its grip. The familiar emotional reactions begin to dissolve. Once felt, automatic starts to feel optional, leaving you in a place where your inner world is no longer run by the past, but shaped by what you repeatedly choose to think, feel, and embody in the present. Conscious moment becomes a signal to the brain that a different future is being prepared, built, and reinforced right now, moment by moment, thought by thought, without force, without struggle, simply through awareness and repetition, allowing the brain to reorganize itself around a new way of being, a new internal pattern that no longer matches who you were, but aligns with who you are becoming as the old circuits fade quietly in the background and the new ones take their place, guiding perception, emotion, and action in ways that once felt impossible, yet now begin to feel natural, familiar, and real as the brain continues to learn from whatever you consistently give your attention to day after day, moment after moment, shaping your experience from the inside out as this process continues unfolding without needing permission from the past or validation from the outside, driven only by the simple truth that what you practice in your mind becomes the structure of your brain and the foundation of your life. And the more you understand this, the more intentional you become with every thought you allow to pass through your awareness, knowing that each one is either reinforcing what has been or quietly building what comes next as the brain responds faithfully to repetition, attention, and emotion, adapting itself to whatever you repeatedly ask it to become, continuing this process as long as you remain conscious of what you are choosing to think. Even now, in this moment, as the wiring continues to shift, reorganize, and form around the patterns you return to again and again, shaping the direction of your life from within without needing a final destination. Only the willingness to remain aware and consistent as the change continues to unfold, naturally, steadily, and progressively, as the brain keeps learning from you, listening to you, responding to what you practice most, without pause, without judgment, simply following the signals you provide. As this rewiring process continues forward, open-ended, evolving, and alive, your emotions are not random reactions to life. Chemical signals that train your body how to live. Every feeling you experience releases a specific cocktail of chemicals into your bloodstream, and those chemicals instruct your cells on how to behave. When an emotion is repeated often enough, the body begins to recognize it as familiar, and familiarity turns into dependence. This is how the body learns emotional states, just as the brain learns thoughts. When you live in stress for long periods of time, your body becomes accustomed to stress chemistry. Levels of adrenaline, cortisol, and other survival-related chemicals become the baseline. Over time, the body doesn't just tolerate these chemicals, it expects them. When they are absent, the body feels uncomfortable, restless, or unsafe. Discomfort is often misinterpreted as a problem in the external world, but in reality, it is the body craving the chemical state it has learned to live in. This is why people can feel uneasy even when nothing is wrong. The mind may say everything is fine. The body is still living in the past. The body does not understand time the way the mind does. It only understands chemistry. If you have been feeling the same emotions every day, the body believes those emotions are happening now. From the body's perspective, the past is still present. This creates a powerful loop. A stressful thought triggers a stressful emotion. That emotion releases stress chemicals. Those chemicals signal the body to stay alert and reactive. The body then sends feedback back to the brain, influencing more stressful thoughts. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. You don't need a reason to feel stressed anymore. The body initiates it on its own. This is what emotional addiction looks like at a biological level. Mean you enjoy stress or fear. It means your body has learned that this state is familiar, and familiar feels safe to the nervous system. Change, even positive change, feels threatening because it introduces unfamiliar chemistry. Calm can feel strange, can feel uncomfortable. Joy can feel unstable, not because they are wrong, but because the body hasn't learned them yet. Breaking the cycle begins with awareness. The moment you notice an emotional reaction without immediately acting on it, you create separation between the body and the mind. That pause is powerful. It interrupts the automatic release of chemicals and gives the nervous system a chance to reset. At first, this feels uncomfortable because the body expects its usual chemical signal. Urge to react, complain, worry, or emotionally charge a situation as the body asking for its familiar dose. If you give in, the loop continues. If you stay present, breathe, and remain conscious, the body experiences something new. It experiences the absence of the old chemistry. This is where discomfort arises, but that discomfort is not danger. It is withdrawal. Just like any addiction, the body resists change before it accepts it. Practice staying present without feeding old emotional reactions. The body begins to recalibrate. The nervous system learns that it is safe without stress. Over time, the baseline chemistry shifts. The body starts to recognize calm, balance, clarity as normal. This is not achieved through force, but through repetition. Each moment of awareness teaches the body something new. Emotions are also signals to the brain about identity. When you repeatedly feel the same way, the brain associates those emotions with who you are. Feeling anxious becomes part of your sense of self. Feeling frustrated becomes familiar territory. Letting go of these emotions can feel like losing part of yourself, even when they are painful. Is why people sometimes cling to emotions that no longer serve them. They feel like home. When you choose to feel differently, even before circumstances change, you are teaching the body a new identity. This does not mean denying reality. No longer letting old emotional conditioning dictate your internal state. Elevated emotions such as gratitude, clarity, compassion, and confidence introduce new chemical signals into the body. These chemicals support growth, repair, rather than survival. The body responds to these new signals by changing how genes are expressed, how systems regulate, and how energy is distributed. Over time, the body becomes aligned with a different internal environment. When the internal environment changes, perception changes. You begin to respond to life instead of reacting to it. Situations that once triggered you lose their charge because the body is no longer primed for stress. This process requires patience and consistency. Conditioning does not dissolve overnight. It dissolves through repeated moments of presence and choice. Each time you interrupt a habitual emotional response, you weaken the old chemical loop. Each time you choose a different emotional state, you strengthen a new one. The body learns through experience, not intention. Eventually, the body stops craving the old emotions. What once felt familiar begins to feel heavy. What once felt uncomfortable begins to feel natural. The moment when real change becomes sustainable. You are no longer managing emotions. You are embodying a new internal state. The body is no longer living in the past because it has learned a new present. And as this learning continues, the emotional signals sent to the brain shift, the nervous system becomes more regulated, and your internal chemistry begins to support clarity instead of chaos, balance instead of survival, allowing you to experience life with greater awareness and less reactivity. As the body continues to adapt to the signals you consistently provide, learning from what you practice emotionally each day, reshaping itself around the states you return to again and again, as the cycle slowly unwinds and a new internal rhythm takes its place. Guided by presence rather than habit, and sustained through conscious repetition rather than unconscious reaction, as the body listens, learns, and responds to the emotional environment you choose to cultivate moment by moment without needing force or suppression. Only awareness and consistency, as this recalibration continues unfolding naturally within the nervous system, allowing a different way of being to stabilize and express itself through your thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions. As the chemistry shifts, the identity shifts, and the body begins to live from a place that no longer depends on old emotional patterns, continuing forward in this learning process, responsive and adaptive, shaped by what you feel most often and what you choose to reinforce. Internal state becomes the new signal, guiding the body into a different relationship with itself and the world, ongoing and evolving. Your personality is not who you truly are. It is who you have practiced being. It is the collection of thoughts you think, the emotions you feel, and the behaviors you repeat so often that they feel automatic. Over time, this practice self becomes familiar, and familiar becomes convincing. You begin to believe this is just how you are, without realizing that this version of you was learned, reinforced, and stabilized through repetition. Every day, your personality sends signals to your brain and body about what to expect from life. The way you interpret events, the tone of your inner voice, emotional reactions you default to, all communicate instructions to your nervous system. Those instructions shape how you perceive opportunities, how you respond to challenges, and how you interact with others. In this way, your personality quietly becomes a filter through which reality is experienced. If you think the same thoughts every day, you will feel the same emotions. If you feel the same emotions, you will make the same choices. If you make the same choices, you will create the same experiences. Over time, this loop reinforces itself. The brain recognizes the pattern and strengthens it. The body memorizes the emotional state and learns to live there. What begins as habit eventually feels like identity. Is why wanting a new life while staying the same internally rarely works. You may hope for change, visualize change, or wait for circumstances to shift. But if your internal state remains unchanged, the same outcomes will continue to appear. The external world often reflects the internal patterns that are most consistent, not because life is unfair, but because your nervous system is tuned to what it knows. A new life requires a new way of being. That does not mean rejecting who you are. Recognizing that who you have been is not fixed. The brain is plastic, the body is adaptive. Identity is flexible when approached with awareness. The moment you realize that your personality has been rehearsed into existence, you also realize it can be rehearsed into something new. This process begins when you notice your habitual reactions. The tone of your thoughts when something doesn't go your way. the emotional response that arises before you consciously choose it. Reactions are not flaws, they are learned responses. Awareness brings them into the light, and what is seen clearly can be changed. When you choose a different response in a familiar situation, you disrupt the old pattern. At first, this feels unnatural. The body may resist, the mind may argue. This resistance is not failure. It is the nervous system adjusting to unfamiliar input. The brain prefers efficiency, and the old pattern is efficient because it has been practiced. The new pattern requires attention. Each time you respond differently, you send a new signal to the brain. You are teaching it that another option exists. When this is repeated, the brain begins to reorganize around the new behavior. The body starts to learn a new emotional state. Over time, unfamiliar becomes familiar. What once required effort begins to feel natural. Identity is not changed through one decision. It is changed through repeated embodiment. When your thoughts align with a new intention and your emotions support it, your behavior naturally follows. This is when change becomes sustainable. You are no longer forcing yourself to act differently. You are expressing a different internal state. This shift often feels subtle at first. You may notice that situations that once triggered you no longer have the same intensity. You pause before reacting. You feel more space between stimulus and response. This space is where choice lives, where the old personality loosens its grip and something new begins to emerge. The brain responds to what you consistently demonstrate, not what you occasionally intend. Consistency signals importance. When you repeatedly think, feel, and act in alignment with a new way of being, the brain updates its model of who you are. The body follows. Hormones change. Nervous system regulation improves. Energy that was once used for survival becomes available for growth. As this internal shift stabilizes, your perception of the world changes. You notice different opportunities. You interpret challenges differently. You respond with greater clarity instead of reflex. This is not because the world has suddenly changed, because you are no longer experiencing it through the same internal filter. Your environment begins to respond to you differently as well. The way you communicate changes. The energy you bring into interactions changes. Others respond to what you embody, what you wish for. This is how internal change expresses itself externally, without force or manipulation. Letting go of an old personality can feel like loss. Even if it was limiting, it was familiar. The nervous system often equates familiar with safe. Stepping into a new way of being requires trust, patience, and repetition. It requires choosing who you want to be even when the old self tries to reassert itself. Each moment you remain conscious of how you think, feel, and act, you are shaping identity. You are not waiting for permission from the past. You are actively instructing the brain and body on who you are becoming. This instruction happens through repetition, presence, and emotional engagement. Over time, the new personality stabilizes. Longer feels like effort. It feels like alignment. The internal struggle quiets. The need to control outcomes diminishes. You begin to live from a place of intention rather than habit. And as this way of being continues to strengthen, identity fades into the background, no longer driving your reactions or defining your limits. As the brain continues to adapt to the signals you provide, updating its map of who you are through every conscious choice, every deliberate response, every moment you decide to think and feel differently, reinforcing a new internal structure that supports a different experience of life, allowing your reality to evolve as your identity evolves, unfolding gradually through practice rather than pressure. The nervous system learns to operate from this new baseline, responding to life from a place that reflects who you are becoming rather than who you were, continuing this process through awareness and repetition, moment by moment, without needing a final destination, only the willingness to remain present as the transformation continues to express itself through your thoughts and actions, shaping your experience from within as the internal patterns reorganize and stabilize, guiding perception and behavior in ways that feel increasingly natural, consistent, and self-directed as the personality you practice becomes the life you live, ongoing, adaptive, open to further change as long as you remain conscious of what you are rehearsing internally, allowing the process to keep unfolding without closure or finality. As identity continues to evolve through what you repeatedly choose to embody in each present moment, the brain does not distinguish clearly between what is happening in the outside world and what is happening vividly in the inner world. From a neurological perspective, experience imagined with strong emotion activates many of the same circuits as an experience that is physically lived. This is not a metaphor. This is how learning occurs in the brain. Whenever you combine intention, attention, and emotion, the brain treats that moment as real and records it. This is why past experiences can continue to influence you long after they are over. When you remember an event and relive it emotionally, the brain fires the same networks. Body releases the same chemistry as if the event were happening again. The nervous system does not know that the experience is over. It only knows the signal it is receiving in the present moment. In this way, memory becomes rehearsal. Rehearsal strengthens the past. The same mechanism can be used to create something new. When you consciously imagine a future state and allow yourself to emotionally experience it, you are giving the brain a blueprint. You are instructing it on what to build. The clearer the image and the stronger the feeling, the more real it becomes to the nervous system. Over time, the brain begins to organize itself around that internal experience. Mental rehearsal is how skills are learned, behaviors are refined, identities are formed. Athletes have used it for decades to improve performance. When they repeatedly visualize a movement, the brain fires the same motor circuits involved in physically performing it. With enough repetition, the body becomes more efficient even before any physical action takes place. This same principle applies to personal change. When you rehearse a new way of being internally, you are practicing before the event. You are teaching the brain and body how to respond ahead of time, reduces uncertainty, which the nervous system often interprets as threat. When a situation arises in real life, the brain recognizes the pattern because it has already experienced it internally. The response feels more natural because it has already been wired. Motion is the key ingredient. Without emotion, a thought remains abstract. With emotion, it becomes embodied. Emotion signals importance to the brain. It tells the nervous system that this experience matters and should be remembered. Emotional states amplify learning. They increase coherence in the brain and allow new connections to form more easily. This is why imagining a future while feeling inspired, grateful, calm, confident is more effective than imagining it while feeling anxious or doubtful. The emotional state you pair with the image becomes part of the wiring. You are not just rehearsing an outcome, you are rehearsing an identity. The brain learns not only what you want to do, but who you are becoming while doing it. At first, this process can feel artificial. The current reality may not match the inner experience you are rehearsing. The brain may argue, the body may resist, is because the old wiring is still dominant. The nervous system trusts what it has experienced repeatedly. New internal experiences require repetition to become credible. Each time you return to the same internal rehearsal, you strengthen the signal. The brain responds by adjusting its structure. Synaptic connections grow stronger. Networks become more efficient. Over time, the internal experience begins to feel familiar. When that happens, the brain no longer treats it as imagination. It treats it expectation. Expectation shapes perception. When the brain expects a certain outcome, it begins to filter information differently. You notice opportunities you once ignored. You respond differently to challenges. You take actions that align with the internal model you have been rehearsing. This is how inner work translates into external change without force. The body also adapts. As you repeatedly feel the emotions associated with the future you are imagining, the body learns those chemical states. Hormonal patterns shift. The nervous system becomes regulated around the new baseline. The body begins to operate as if the future experience is already familiar. This is where consistency becomes more important than intensity. One strong visualization can inspire, but repeated rehearsal is what rewires. The brain learns through frequency. Each return to the same internal experience reinforces the message. Over time, patterns lose dominance because they are no longer being rehearsed with the same emotional charge. Eventually, the line between imagination and reality begins to blur. Not in a way that disconnects you from the present, but in a way that aligns you with possibility. You begin to act in accordance with the future you have been rehearsing. Decisions feel clearer. Reactions feel less automatic. You are no longer waiting for circumstances to change before you change. Process does not require forcing belief. Belief emerges naturally when the brain has enough evidence. Each internal rehearsal is evidence. Each emotional experience is data. The brain updates its model of reality based on what it repeatedly experiences, internally or externally. When the internal experience becomes stable, the external world often begins to reflect it. Not because of coincidence, but because perception, behavior, and energy have shifted. You show up differently. You communicate differently. You respond differently. The environment responds to those changes. Mental rehearsal is not about escaping the present. It is about training the nervous system for what comes next. It is about becoming familiar with a future state so that when opportunities arise, you are neurologically prepared to step into them. The brain moves toward what feels known. When the future feels known internally, it becomes easier to live externally. As this practice continues, the old internal narratives lose their emotional charge. brain no longer returns to them as often because they are no longer being reinforced. Attention shifts naturally toward the new internal model. What you focus on consistently becomes what the brain organizes around. This is how transformation happens quietly, internally, before it becomes visible externally. It begins with repeated inner experiences that teach the brain and body what is possible, allowing them to reorganize around that possibility, responding to the signals you provide through intention, attention, as the internal rehearsal continues to shape neural structure. Chemical balance and perception gradually aligning your inner world with a different way of being as the brain continues to learn from what you imagine and feel, adapting itself to the experiences you practice most moment by moment, repetition by repetition. As this internal training unfolds without needing validation or immediate results, driven by consistency rather than force, future becomes neurologically familiar and increasingly accessible through the ongoing process of conscious rehearsal and embodied emotion, continuing to evolve as long as you remain engaged in the practice of directing your inner experience toward what you are becoming. Stillness is not inactivity. It is a biological and neurological state where real change becomes possible. When the body is constantly moving, reacting, and responding to external demands, the nervous system remains oriented toward the outside world. In that state, the brain prioritizes survival, prediction, and control. This is useful when there is real danger. When it becomes chronic, the brain loses flexibility. It becomes efficient at repeating the past rather than creating something new. When you slow the body down and reduce sensory input, the brain receives a different signal. Muscles relax, breathing changes. Nervous system begins to shift out of high alert. This shift is not psychological, it is physiological. The brain waves slow, and the neural networks responsible for constant analysis and reactivity become less dominant. In this quieter state, the brain becomes receptive to new information. Most people avoid stillness because it feels uncomfortable at first. When the external noise fades, internal noise becomes more noticeable. Thoughts surface. Emotions rise. Sensations demand attention. This is not a problem. This is awareness. The mind is revealing the patterns that normally stay hidden beneath distraction. Stillness exposes what has been running automatically. The discomfort many people feel in stillness is not caused by silence. It is caused by the nervous system no longer being fed its usual stimulation. When the brain is used to constant input, quiet feels unfamiliar. The body may interpret this unfamiliar state as unsafe, even though nothing is wrong. This is why the urge to check a phone, think about problems, or plan the future arises so quickly. These habits restore familiar neural activity. When you remain still and present despite this urge, something important begins to happen. Brain starts to disengage from habitual circuits. Energy that was flowing through familiar pathways begins to slow. Without constant reinforcement, old neural patterns lose momentum. This creates space. In that space, the brain becomes more plastic, more capable of reorganizing itself. Stillness allows you to step out of the constant feedback loop between thought and emotion. When the body is calm and the mind is present, emotions lose some of their charge. Thoughts arise but do not automatically pull you into reaction. This separation is critical. It allows you to observe without immediately responding. Observation weakens identification, and identification is what keeps patterns in place. In this state, the brain is no longer predicting based solely on the past. It is available to receive new signals. This is where intention becomes powerful. When you introduce a clear intention in a calm state, the brain receives it without resistance, less internal noise competing for attention. The signal becomes clearer. Stillness also changes how the body interprets safety. When you remain calm without external reassurance, the nervous system learns that safety can exist internally. Retraining is subtle but profound. Over time, the body no longer depends on external conditions to regulate itself. This internal regulation is what allows new emotional states to stabilize. As stillness becomes familiar, the brain begins to associate calm with normal functioning rather than absence of activity. This recalibration affects perception. You become less reactive to external stimuli. Situations that once triggered immediate stress responses begin to register differently. The pause between stimulus and response lengthens. In that pause, choice emerges. The brain learns from states, not concepts. Being still teaches the brain something that thinking about stillness never can. Each time you enter a calm, present state, you are given the nervous system direct experience. That experience becomes reference. With repetition, the brain recognizes that it can function without constant tension. This state is also where integration happens. Information processed during active states gets reorganized during quiet states. Neural connections are refined. Systems synchronize, the brain becomes more coherent. This coherence supports clarity, creativity, and insight. Ideas arise not because you force them, because the mind has space to connect information in new ways. Stillness does not remove challenges from life. It changes how the nervous system meets them. When you are practiced in calm presence, challenges no longer automatically trigger survival responses. Remain more regulated, which allows access to higher cognitive functions. Problem solving improves, emotional regulation stabilizes, perspective broadens. This is why stillness is foundational to change. Without it, intentions compete with old patterns for dominance. With it, the brain becomes receptive. The body becomes cooperative. Change no longer feels like effort. It feels like alignment. Over time, stillness becomes less something you do and more something you carry. The nervous system learns to return to balance more quickly. Reactivity decreases. Awareness increases. You spend less energy managing internal chaos and more energy directing attention intentionally. The effects extend beyond the moments of stillness themselves. Influence how you think, how you feel, and how you respond throughout the day. The brain continues to reference the calm state even when you are active. This reference point changes baseline functioning. As this baseline shifts, old habits lose urgency that once demanded attention pass more easily. Emotional reactions soften. You are no longer pulled as strongly by the same internal currents. The mind becomes a tool rather than a driver. Stillness also strengthens your ability to remain present with uncertainty. When you are no longer dependent on constant mental activity, uncertainty becomes less threatening. The nervous system tolerates not knowing. Tolerance opens the door to growth because new possibilities always emerge from the unknown. With continued practice, the brain begins to associate stillness with clarity rather than boredom. The body associates it with safety rather than vulnerability. Reversal changes your relationship with your inner world. Instead of avoiding silence, you begin to trust it. This trust allows deeper awareness. Subtle thoughts become noticeable. Emotional undercurrents become clearer. You recognize patterns earlier, before they fully activate. This early recognition gives you more choice. You can redirect attention before old loops take over. Stillness does not make life passive, it makes action more intentional. When the internal environment is stable, actions are cleaner, reactive, more aligned. You respond rather than react. You choose rather than default. As this way of being continues to develop, the brain reorganizes around a calmer internal reference. Neural circuits supporting regulation strengthen. Circuits driven by constant threat weaken. The nervous system becomes more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of sustaining change. This process unfolds gradually. There is no single moment where everything shifts. There are many moments where you choose presence over habit. Each moment reinforces the nervous system's ability to remain regulated. Over time, these moments accumulate. The result is not a life without challenge, a life where challenge does not dictate your internal state. Stillness becomes the ground from which you move, think, and feel, supporting a different relationship with your mind and body as the nervous system continues to learn from the signals you provide through presence, allowing internal organization to shift toward balance, coherence, and adaptability. State becomes more familiar and more accessible, shaping how you experience yourself and the world moment by moment without needing to reach an endpoint as the process continues to deepen through repeated returns to awareness and calm, reinforcing a way of being that supports transformation from the inside out. At first, change feels uncomfortable because the brain resists anything that challenges the familiar. The neural networks that have been reinforced for years, sometimes decades, fight against disruption. They do not resist because you are failing or because you lack willpower. They resist because they are trained to maintain consistency. The brain's primary job is efficiency, not growth. It prefers to run the same circuits, to rely on the same automatic responses, and to return to the same emotional states because they require less energy and predictability feels safe. The moment you attempt to think differently, feel differently, or act differently, old circuits signal discomfort, doubt, or fear. This resistance is biological, not personal. Every time you encounter this resistance, it is a signal that the brain is shifting. Old patterns do not disappear immediately, reinforced over time with thought, emotion, and behavior. Attempting to force them out only strengthens the sense of struggle. Real transformation happens when you acknowledge the resistance without reacting to it. Awareness of the old pattern creates a small gap between the habitual response and your conscious choice. Within that gap lies the power to rewire. When you choose differently in that moment, even a subtle way, you begin to weaken the old wiring. This is the essence of neuroplasticity. Neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that are ignored gradually lose strength. Repeatedly choosing new thoughts, new feelings, and new actions gradually shifts the dominant neural networks. At first, feels effortful because the old pathways are still dominant. Over time, however, the new pathways grow stronger, more efficient, and begin to feel natural. This is the process by which old identities lose their hold and new ways of being emerge. Patience is essential in this process. Change cannot be rushed. The nervous system needs repeated experience to update itself. Each moment of conscious choice reinforces a new internal pattern. One decision alone does not change the brain. 10 decisions are better. Hundreds of consistent repetitions are what truly shift identity. The brain updates based on frequency and emotional intensity, not intention alone. Each time you consistently respond differently than your habitual self, brain treats that as evidence that a new pattern is more relevant than the old one. The old self often tries to reassert itself. Thoughts, emotions, and impulses will return as if to test your commitment. This is normal. The familiar feels safe, even if it has caused suffering. The resistance you feel is a measure of how entrenched the old pattern has become. It is also an opportunity. Each time you pause, choose, and act differently, you signal to the brain that the future you are cultivating is more important than the past you have learned to repeat. The brain begins to recognize this new pattern as valuable, and slowly, repetition becomes habit. Every time you interrupt an old pattern, you create space for something new. That space allows the brain to explore possibilities that were previously blocked. The nervous system can shift from reactive survival mode to a more creative and adaptive state. This shift is subtle at first. You may notice small differences in your thoughts, emotions, or reactions. Over time, these small differences accumulate, producing significant change. The brain responds not to immediate results, but to the consistency of the practice. Important to remain conscious of the internal dialogue during this process. The mind will often generate doubts, fears, and self-criticism as part of the brain's resistance. These are not indications of failure, but indicators that change is occurring. Observing these thoughts without judgment allows the nervous system to integrate the new pattern without being pulled back into the old one. Over time, the old mental chatter loses its charge because it is no longer reinforced with energy or attention. The process of change is also deeply emotional. The body is conditioned to certain chemical states, and shifting patterns requires the body to experience unfamiliar emotions. The brain links thought and emotion. So when you choose new thoughts, also allow yourself to feel new emotions. Elevated emotions such as gratitude, confidence, or curiosity support the rewiring process, while repetitive negative emotions reinforce old circuits. Emotional practice, therefore, important as cognitive practice. Each emotional rehearsal strengthens new pathways and weakens the old ones. Consistency and repetition are critical. Change is not an event, it is a process. The brain updates itself gradually, reinforcing whatever you repeatedly practice. This is why patience is essential. Each day presents multiple opportunities to practice new thoughts, new emotions, and new behaviors. Each practice session, no matter how small, contributes to a larger pattern over time. The more consistently you return to the new behavior, the more dominant it becomes, and the less power the old self has to interfere. Over time, the repetition of new patterns begins to alter your perception of the world. Situations that once triggered habitual reactions no longer do. Choices that once felt difficult begin to feel natural. Your internal state stabilizes around the new pattern rather than the old one. Is point at which the brain begins to reorganize itself around the new identity. The old wiring does not vanish instantly, but it gradually loses dominance as the new circuits strengthen. Ongoing process allows the future you are creating to become increasingly real and accessible. As the brain responds to the consistent repeated signals of new thought, feeling, and action, gradually reorganizing internal patterns, stabilizing new ways of being, reducing the influence of old habitual patterns. As each moment of conscious choice strengthens the new identity and weakens the old one, allowing transformation to continue unfolding naturally, gradually, and continuously. The life you experience is a reflection of the internal state you carry. Most people assume that circumstances shape who they are, but neuroscience shows that the inner world is the true driver. Thoughts, emotions, habitual patterns of behavior create a blueprint for reality, and the brain and body follow that blueprint faithfully. When you understand this, you begin to realize that transformation is not about controlling external events, consciously shaping the internal environment from which life naturally emerges. Every moment you think, feel, or act in alignment with old patterns, you reinforce them. These patterns create expectations. Brain becomes tuned to notice evidence that confirms those expectations. The cycle perpetuates itself. You might wish for a different outcome, a different life, or different circumstances. The internal wiring continues to recreate the familiar because that is what has been practiced. The first step in breaking free is realizing that the mind and body operate as a cohesive system, constantly generating the reality you inhabit through repeated internal signals. Change begins when you intentionally cultivate new thoughts and pair them with elevated emotions. Thoughts alone are instructions to the brain, but when combined with emotions, they become embodied signals. The nervous system treats these signals as reality. Gratitude, joy, confidence, and curiosity are not just feelings. They are chemical and electrical messages that instruct the body and mind to reorganize around a different way of being. Over time, repeated practice of these new internal states strengthens neural networks that support the future you wish to experience. The process is cumulative. Each time you focus on a new way of thinking, you lay down a neural pathway. Each time you pair that thought with a supportive emotion, the pathway becomes stronger. When you act consistently with this internal state, the brain recognizes it as familiar, and the new identity begins to solidify. Once felt difficult or forced becomes natural. The old self, which was built on repetition of limiting patterns, gradually loses its dominance, not because it is erased, but because it is no longer reinforced. System adapts to what you consistently give energy to. Awareness is a critical component in this process. Without noticing old patterns, they continue unconsciously. Observation interrupts automaticity. When you pause to see a habitual thought or emotional reaction, you create a space where choice can emerge. This space is where transformation is possible. Each conscious choice to respond differently sends a signal to the brain that a new way of being is relevant and viable. Repetition of this conscious practice reshapes the internal landscape gradually. The body plays an equally important role. Emotions are chemical signals, and the body learns to live in particular states over time. If you have lived in stress, anxiety, or fear, the body has come accustomed to those chemical patterns. Introducing new emotional experiences teaches the body that it is safe to exist in a different state. As the nervous system recalibrates, you become less reactive to external triggers. Your internal environment becomes a reliable source of stability and creativity. The body begins to support the new identity rather than resisting it. Visualization and mental rehearsal amplify this process. The brain does not distinguish sharply between imagined experience and actual experience. Vividly imagining a future while feeling the emotions associated with that future trains the nervous system to accept it as real. The clearer and more emotionally charged the internal rehearsal, the more effectively the brain updates its model of reality. Over time, the neural networks formed through this internal experience begin to influence how you perceive, interpret, respond to real-life events. The future you are practicing internally starts to manifest externally. Consistency and patience are essential because transformation is gradual. The brain is designed to favor the familiar. Old patterns have energy behind them. New must be reinforced repeatedly to gain traction. Each day presents countless moments where you can practice this new internal state. Each moment reinforces the signal to the nervous system that a different way of being is not only possible, sustainable. Over time, these repeated choices accumulate, producing measurable change in thoughts, emotions, behavior, and perception. As the internal patterns stabilize, the external world often begins to reflect the change. You notice new opportunities, respond differently to challenges, and engage with life from a place of alignment rather than reaction. Actions naturally follow the internal state. What once required effort to change now happens automatically because the brain, body, nervous system are operating in coherence with the new pattern. The old self loses dominance not through struggle, but through repeated intentional internal practice. The ongoing process of transformation is not about achieving perfection. Consistently providing the nervous system with new supportive signals. Each choice, thought, feeling, and action reinforces the internal state you want to inhabit. Over time, the brain integrates these signals into its operating system, creating a new default mode of functioning. The internal environment becomes a reliable foundation for how you experience life, shaping perception, behavior, and circumstance without the need for external control. Conscious repetition, elevated emotion, and persistent awareness, the brain begins to embody the future you are creating internally. As this internal state strengthens, it exerts a gravitational pull on your experiences, guiding your perceptions, decisions, interactions in alignment with the new identity. The nervous system learns to sustain this state, the body adjusts its chemistry, and the mind naturally aligns with the new way of being. The process continues to unfold as long as conscious practice persists, gradually transforming identity, perception, and life itself moment by moment, thought by thought, feeling by feeling, and action by action. as the brain and body faithfully respond to the internal signals consistently provided, shaping reality from the inside out, deepening coherence, stability, and alignment with the life you are intentionally cultivating, reinforcing the neural, emotional, and behavioral structures that support this transformation, and allowing the continuous evolution of who you are to manifest naturally, organically, and progressively through sustained attention, presence, and repetition. The journey of transformation begins within. Every thought, emotion, and action you choose becomes a signal to your brain and body, gradually reshaping who you are and how you experience life. Change does not come from external circumstances. It emerges from consistent, conscious practice of new ways of thinking, feeling, and being. By becoming aware of old patterns, embracing stillness, intentionally rehearsing new internal states, you give the nervous system a blueprint for a different future. Over time, the brain, body, and mind align with the life you are creating, allowing perception, behavior, experiences to reflect the new identity you are cultivating. Transformation is not a single moment, but a continuous process of conscious choice, repetition, and emotional engagement. The power to live a life that feels authentic, empowered, aligned is not somewhere out in the world. It is already within you, waiting to be practiced, embodied, and fully expressed.